Chapter 2, Part 2 of Explorers and Travelers by Adolphus W. Greely. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Tomko. Chapter 2, Part 2, Peter Le Moyne, Sieur d'Iberville. English vessels had been cruising in the neighborhood of San Domingo, which led Iberville to believe that it was a colonizing expedition. So he worked day and night in completing his preparations, and on January 1st, 1699, sailed for the Gulf of Mexico. On the afternoon of the 23rd day, Iberville, as usual leading, land was sighted in the northeast. It proved to be the harbor of Pensacola, where Iberville was chagrined to find himself preceded by a Spanish colony under command of Don Andres de la Riola. There were two frigates yet in the harbor, which 4 months before had brought up 300 colonists from Vera Cruz. The half-finished fort, the dissatisfied garrison, and the uncertainty of the future explorations to the westward were so many inducements for Iberville to drive out the Spaniards and secure the harbor. Iberville made arrangements to enter the harbor, but was notified by the Spanish governor that he had formal orders from Spain to permit no foreign ships to enter the harbor. Under pretense that he feared heavy weather, the French fleet sounded the entrance to the harbor and prepared to enter. The Spanish commander, however, begged that they would retire, and fortunately, having been given information by the Spanish pilot, Iberville decided to sail to the west. Iberville, exploring the coast, anchored at the eastern point of the entrance to Mobile Bay, where violent gales nearly destroyed the squadron. Reconnoitering boats giving such unsatisfactory reports of the depth of the channel, Iberville determined, with his usual energy, to survey it himself. Taking his younger brother Bienville and a crew of his faithful Canadians, he started, despite approaching darkness, so as to begin work at daylight. The storm breaking with great violence, Iberville's efforts to make headway over the billows were in vain. Finally, his rowers exhausted, the boat was turned to the nearest land, but the sea was so high and the wind so violent that unceasing efforts were needful to prevent the boat from swamping. It was due to Iberville's great skill that the boat was finally beached in a favorable spot on the sandy beach, which the crew reached with difficulty, so exhausted were they with their struggles. Here they were weather-bound 3 days, and so had an opportunity to explore the island. It was with horror that they discovered in one place ghastly piles of human bones and skulls, mute witnesses of a scene of slaughter, which terrified many of the crew until they found the island to be uninhabited. The island, now known as Dauphin, was called Massacre by Iberville, who, undisturbed by the sight, visited the mainland with a few of his men, and made every effort to discover the inhabitants, of whom he found recent traces. Finally came good weather, and with it the continued voyage to the west brought the fleet to safe anchorage on a bright February morn off Ship Island. The livestock landed, Iberville gave his freight consorts permission to return to France, while he explored the mainland that now lay fair and bright before him. The Indians were communicated with, after many failures, but, beyond the discovery of the Pascagoula and reports of a larger river to the west, which the Bayogoula Indians called Malbochia, no valuable information was obtained. Iberville planned to reach the great river by one of its reported outlets, and, following the main channel down, thus learn the way for his vessel. But the Indians giving him the slip, it only remained to search every foot of the coast until the river was gained. He was thus thrown on his own resources, which had never failed, and were not to do so now. Iberville, with his brother Bienville, and 50 picked men, largely Canadians, and 20 days' provisions, started February 27th on 2 Biscayennes, or barges, for his difficult task, the discovery of the mouth of the Mississippi. It is useless to detail this journey of Iberville through an apparently endless maze of islets, mud banks, sand banks, reefs, and marshy shoals, which go to make up the great level delta of the Mississippi. It would, even to day, be a difficult search for most mariners without a chart, but then well nigh impossible. Iberville's skill and patience were tasked to the utmost, and when he did find the mouth of the great river, it almost seemed to be by the intervention of Providence. On the eve of March 3, 1699, while struggling along the mainland, to which they persistently clung, the violence of an increasing gale threatened to swamp their barges, despite every effort, if they kept off shore, while every approach to watch the shore line, and thus make certain of the river mouth, incurred danger of beaching and destruction. Darkness came on and the gale increased, making certain, as it seemed to them, that they must choose death at sea or death on land. Suddenly Iberville put his barge before the wind and into the face of death, as his followers thought, but it shot between huge piles of interlaced driftwood into a turbid stream of whitish water. Iberville put out his hand and tasted. The water was fresh, and the Mississippi was rediscovered. The Spaniards had spoken of the river as La Palisada, which Iberville thought most appropriate when he saw the bristling barricades of huge jagged trees with outstretched limbs and contorted roots borne incessantly onward by the strong current. Iberville camped that night at the edge of the dense rank sedge growth, saying, "Stretched on the sedges and sheltered from the gale, our pleasure is so much the greater that we feel our escape from a great peril. It is a very lively business, this exploring the unknown shores of a sea in shallops too small to carry sail in the open sea, too tiny to anchor, and yet so large that they strand and ground half a league from land." The next morn was that of Mardi Gras, when our devout explorers celebrated Mass, sang joyfully the Te Deum, and raised a commemorative cross before voyaging further. Never in their wildest dreams could the hardy Canadian explorers, from their marshy camp in the delta of the Mississippi, ever have presaged that in the coming time, from the many millions of future inhabitants in the valley of the Mississippi, should be gathered tens of thousands to celebrate the merry day of carnival in the metropolitan city that was to spring up from their memorable voyage. The Mississippi was near its high stage, so that travel was tediously slow, mostly by oar. The land rose somewhat. The sedge gave way first to cane and willows, and later to richly foliaged trees with graceful festoons pleasing to the eye and fruitful of promise in the coming autumn. The country, largely flooded, would have seemed uninhabited save for the Indian ferry boats, bundles of cane pointed at both ends and fastened together by cross bars of wood, and an occasional column of smoke rising in the distant blue. The rapid current obliged the oarsmen to hug the bank closely, while diminishing food and increasing piles of driftwood discouraged them, but the indomitable Iberville cheered on his Canadians, and on the fifth day, some 35 leagues from the river's mouth, 6 pirogues, or canoes, full of Indians were seen. The savages fled, but one was captured, and through him communication and friendly overtures were established with the Onotchis. Through these Indians, Iberville was taken to the present site of New Orleans, and was shown the portage over which the Indians traveled to Lake Pontchartrain, and thence to the bay where the ship was at anchor. Farther up the stream, Iberville visited the village of the Bayougulas, which consisted of about 200 souls. The men, well made, with short hair and painted faces, stalked around most unconcernedly in a naked state. The women blackened their teeth, tied up their hair in a top knot, tattooed their faces and breasts, and wore girdles woven of bark fiber, dyed red or bleached white, with pendulous fringes reaching to the knee. The ornaments of the women were metal bracelets and bangles and fancy articles made of feathers, while the young braves wore sashes of feathers, which, weighted with bits of metal, made merry sound as they danced. In short, they were an inoffensive folk, content with the simple fruits of the earth, which largely served as their sustenance. Iberville visited one of their temples, a structure some 30 feet in diameter, which Charlevoix describes as follows: In the center were slowly burning logs, keeping up a perpetual fire, and at the end a platform on which lay skins of deer, buffalo, and bear, offerings to the Chuchomuacha, the opossum, the god of the Bayougulas, which animal was painted in red and black at various points in the temple. The roof was decorated with the figures of various animals, among which a red fox was conspicuous. On either side of the entrance were other animal figures, such as bears and wolves, and also various birds, but above all the chuchowacha, the opossum, an animal about the size and having the head of the sucking pig, the white and gray fur of the badger, the tail of the rat, the paws of an ape, and a sack under its stomach. The great discrepancies between the topography of the river and the descriptions given in the accounts of the journeys of La Salle and Tonty so impressed Iberville that he was really doubtful if he was on the Mississippi, and so his journey was pursued up the river to Omas, a short distance below the mouth of the Red River. Fortunately, his brother, Bienville, obtained from an Indian chief a letter, which the savage had carried for 13 years, given him by Tonty, who descended the river from Illinois in 1686, and left this letter addressed to La Salle, whose active and loyal assistant Tonty was. Iberville was now over 700 miles distant from his ship, and his original stock of provisions was exhausted, so that the men were obliged to live on the corn of the Indians and such meat or game as could be bought or killed. Sending his men back by the Delta with the barges, Iberville decided to try himself the route of portages to the Gulf. With an Indian guide, he entered the Ascantia, a narrow, winding bayou, where with his 4 Canadians and 2 pirogues, 50 portages over fallen trees and drift were made the first day in a distance of 7 leagues. It is not surprising that the Indian guide, unaccustomed to such tremendous labor and fatigue, deserted the second day. Iberville, none the less, pushed on undauntedly, confident that he could reach his ship through this unknown country, guide or no guide. Next, one of his hardy Canadians fell sick, and Iberville took his place and oar, and in the portages carried his end of a pirogue. After 80 portages they passed into Lake Maurepas, and next into Lake Pontchartrain, whence the way was easy to the ship, which was reached 8 hours in advance of the barges from the Delta. In his absence of 6 weeks, Iberville had found again the Mississippi, explored its shores almost to the Red River, made friends with all its native tribes, discovered the short route to the sea, traveled about 1,500 miles, and had returned to his ship with every man of his party. What volumes these few facts speak for the energy, tact, skill, and foresight of this wonderful Canadian. Casting about for a convenient spot, Iberville decided to build his fort at the head of Biloxi Bay, and in this unfortunate location, under the spurring supervision of the chief, Fort Biloxi soon rose, and there, on Easter Sunday, mass was celebrated, vespers sung, and a sermon preached. On May 2, 1700, Iberville sailed for France, leaving his lieutenant, Sauvole, as the first governor of the province of Louisiana, and Bienville second in command. The action of France and the desperate haste of Iberville in occupying the mouth of the Mississippi were most timely. The very month in which our Canadians sailed from Brest an expedition left England under the auspices of Mr. Cox, who sent out 3 vessels loaded with immigrants. They wintered in the Carolinas, where many settled, but in 1700 2 ships continued their voyage to the Mississippi. One of these vessels was commanded by a Captain Banks, who, once captured by Iberville in Hudson Bay, now found himself worsted by his rival in the peaceful work of colonization. One of the English ships appeared in the lower Mississippi, into which Banks had found entrance, in September, 1700. Bienville, with 5 men and 2 pirogues, met the English vessel, and setting forth to the captain that France was in possession of all the surrounding country, succeeded either by argument or cajolery in persuading the captain to withdraw from the Mississippi. Iberville was not long delayed by the delights and pleasures of the French court, but speedily returned to Biloxi, where he arrived on the eve of Twelfth Night with supplies, and, more important of all, with 60 hardy and energetic Canadians, with whom he established a fort a short distance below the present site of New Orleans. The winter proved a very cold one, the drinking water freezing in the cups, but it did not delay the rapid progress of the new fort. In the midst of this work, Chevalier de Tonty arrived with 20 Canadians from their former settlement in Illinois. Thus, for the first time, with intercommunication established between the permanent settlement in Illinois, Tonty's fort on the Arkansas, and the new colony at the mouth of the Mississippi, Iberville felt that France had indeed entered into actual possession of its great province of Louisiana. He realized, however, the necessity of permanently connecting these settlements, many hundreds miles apart, and of facilitating intercommunication through the establishment of intermediate posts. Iberville contemplated an exploration of the Red River, thinking it might afford access to the gold and silver mines of New Spain, but abandoned the project owing to the representations of the Indians that the river was unnavigable from the interlaced driftwood, later known as rafts. He turned his attention to the main river, the Mississippi, and visited the Natchez, a brave and powerful tribe of Indians, whose country delighted his heart as resembling France, and where he planned a city to be called Rosalie, now Natchez, which, however, it was not his fate to ever see take definite form, as it was only built long after his death, in 1714, by his brother Bienville. It was at this time that Le Sueur went up the Mississippi by Iberville, discovered the St. Peter River in Minnesota, and, attempting mining operations, later brought back a worthless cargo of green earth. To Iberville's credit, it may be said he viewed this and many other similar schemes of development with a skeptical and practical eye. Later, he sent his brother Bienville across the country to explore the Red River, which was done with good success. His priest Montigny was also active in extending the faith, both among the Natchez Indians and in the basin of the Tensas River. Indeed, every effort was made under Iberville's sagacious direction to obtain a knowledge of the possibilities of the country so that its resources might be properly developed. Iberville returned to France ill with fever, but despite his disease, he displayed extraordinary energy in personally advancing the practical affairs of his new colony. Moreover, he prepared a memoir urging the cession of Pensacola by Spain to France, which nation was to establish forts and arm the Indians along the Mississippi River, whereby the interior of America from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada would be under French domination, save the narrow strip along the Atlantic coast already occupied by England. It was a sagacious scheme which, if it had been properly supported by France, would have entirely changed the future of America. It received, however, but a perfunctory support, and only resulted in exciting the jealousy of Spain. Iberville's last voyage to Louisiana was made in 1701, when his health, undermined by the climate, was impaired by the formation of an abscess which confined him to his bed for 2 months. His mind worked incessantly, and his activity through other lands was wonderful. He planned the Royal Magazines on Dauphin Island, located the new post on Mobile River, told off the relief of workmen for the various enterprises, planned flatboats for lighters, extended relief to the Spaniards at Vera Cruz, and sent Tonty as an agent to make peace with the Choctaws and Chickasaws and secure them as allies. His sailor's eye was particularly pleased with the magnificent forests of Mobile Bay, where the oaks and pines presented the finest timber for shipbuilding he had ever seen. With Mobile commenced, the royal storehouses erected, and the alliance of the Choctaws and Chickasaws secured, Iberville felt that the colony of Louisiana was on a secure foundation, and on March 31st he sailed from Dauphin Island, then the headquarters of that colony for which he had done so much, and which he was destined never again to see. The domain of Louisiana, obtained by so much heroic endeavor and individual suffering on the part of Joliet, Marquette, La Salle, Tonty, Iberville, and their associates, passed at once, by an edict of Louis XIV, into a monopoly and under the control of a courtier, Anton Crozat, for trading purposes by the decree of September 14, 1712. In this decree, the limits of Louisiana were for the first time defined, including all the territories by us, France, possessed and bounded by New Mexico and by those of the English in Carolina. The river St. Louis, formerly called the Mississippi, from the seashore to the Illinois, together with the rivers St. Philippe, formerly called the Missouris, and the St. Jerome, formerly called the Wabash, the Ohio, with all the countries, territories, lakes in the land, and the rivers emptying directly or indirectly into that part of the river St. Louis. All the said territories, countries, rivers, streams, and islands we will to be and remain comprised under the name of the government of Louisiana. There was another and blacker page to the decree, whereby Crozat was further authorized to introduce African slavery. If the aforesaid Sieur Crozat considers it advisable to have negroes in the said country of Louisiana, for agriculture or other use on plantations, he can send a ship each year to trade directly with the Guinea coast, and is further authorized to sell negroes to the settlers of Louisiana. But prior to this condition of affairs, the great Canadian naval commander had passed to his final reward, having died of yellow fever at Havana, July 9, 1706. The last leaf in his history was, however, an effort through his personal bravery and skill to secure French domination in America by driving out of the Antilles the determined English seamen whose successful raids so often militated against the interests of France. Despite his health, undermined by fevers, Iberville left France with a fleet with which he hoped to carry out this great plan. Intending to make a descent upon Barbados, he learned that the English, warned of his plans, were prepared for him. He therefore seized on the islands of Nevis and St. Christopher, where his fleet captured an enormous amount of booty of all kinds. He decided next to ravage the English colonies in the Carolinas, but stopping at Havana for reinforcements, he lost his own life by the epidemic, which destroyed 800 others of his fleet. Among the qualities of this great Canadian, all must admire his intrepidity in war, his skill as a navigator, and his capacity as an explorer. But beyond these were the astonishing administrative ability and political sagacity which he displayed in such an eminent degree in the planning, founding, and fostering of the great province of Louisiana. End of Chapter 2, Part 2. Recording by William Tomko.